I'm just so thrilled that Jon Schnur is with us tonight, and I know all of you in the audience are as well. Before I forget, I want to tell you that we're going to have a reception up in the Elliott Lyman room, and we may end a few minutes early so that we have more time for one-on-one interactions with Jon, so you're all invited. Not surprisingly, we invited him here because of the unique perspective that he represents, not only as a successful social entrepreneur, but also as an influential policymaker. I teased Jon because we like to claim him as an alum, and he almost was one. He entered our master's program, had the idea for New Leaders for New Schools, got funding to do it, and did the sensible thing, like Bill Gates, and he left his studies to go pursue his dream. But he's now a member of our visiting committee, which is a committee that gives the president and provost good advice about the future direction of the school. And we feel very fortunate to be able to rely on Jon as a trusted advisor. So, as I alluded to, as many of you know, Jon is truly a pioneer in the world of education reform. He really came of age as the education reform movement, as we now know it, was just getting started. He co-founded and served as the CEO of the national nonprofit organization New Leaders for New Schools for many, many years. That organization develops transformational school leaders, and it does it well. And although I think we all know about that work, we may not know as much about his extensive work as a policymaker. He began when he was 12 years old, I think, as a special assistant to U.S. Secretary of Education Dick Riley under the Clinton administration. He was a senior policy advisor on education to Vice President Gore. He was the Associate Director for Education Policy to President Clinton, the co-chairman of the Obama for America Education Policy Committee, and a senior advisor to U.S. Secretary of Education Arne Duncan. So in his hands has been a lot of good advice on national policy related to teacher and principal quality, after-school programs, district reform, charter schools, and early learning and preschools. He also advises a number of philanthropists on how to invest wisely in education, and we're grateful for that because he has such good taste. He's currently the executive chairman and co-founder of America Achieves. America Achieves is an organization that helps communities and states leverage policy, practice, and leadership. And I know you're going to hear a lot more about that from Jon tonight. So we've asked him if he would be willing to speak on a wide range of topics, and he has agreed. I assume we'll hear a little bit about Obama's education policy agenda during the second term, about what actions can be taken to improve American education at large and at scale over the next decade, and educational career options for Harvard graduates who might be sitting in the audience. So we promised to save lots of time for questions and answers, but Jon's going to begin with a reflection on his work. So please join me in welcoming Jon Schnur.
Well, thank you very much, Kathy. Everyone in this school is very lucky to have Dean McCartney, having served the incredible role that she's played here at the education school. So I just want to start off with actually a hand for you, given everything you've done, Dean. I also know that, actually, you can hear me even if, can you hear me even when I'm standing away from the mic? Great. You guys, technical support is great. Thank you guys. So I am thrilled to be here tonight, both with those of you in this hall, and I know Matt advised me in terms of the, through technology, through an audience across the country now and over the next couple weeks, so both people in the hall and through technology, just thrilled to be with you here tonight. There is such expertise in this room. I see a number of people who I think are just some of the guiding educational leaders of our time who are here. Some of you I don't know. I know have a tremendous expertise yourselves. So I at first didn't like the idea of giving an address because I actually wanted just a discussion and a quick interaction with you. But they said that's the protocol here, so I'll give you some comments first. But I want to leave a lot of time for questions and discussion because this is an amazing opportunity for me. I actually had lunch with some of the students in the leadership doctoral program today, and it was just a great experience. Just people with such insight and great questions pushed my thinking and helped me in my thinking too. So I'm looking forward to that with you. But I'll start with sharing some of my perspective, one person's lens, on where we are in education in America. What's happened over the last couple decades that's been significant from a policy and practice and educational systems change perspective. And I think some of the key needs and opportunities moving forward if we really are to realize the potential really of all of our kids from every background and the potential of our country. And I'll talk some about my own personal experience and my own personal lens and some of the work I've done in the policy world and nonprofit world. Highlight a few of the major challenges that I think we face, and then open it up for discussion and Q&A. I'll start with by saying, I guess a personal reflection and note, all of us have come to education from various vantage points, but I think most of the room with a deeply held conviction or experience about the importance of education for human development, for enabling kids to succeed, and for enabling broader community success. I know I did. I grew up in Milwaukee. My mom was, she co-founded one of the first racially integrated preschools in Milwaukee back in the 1960s that I attended. She also co-founded the Milwaukee Children's Museum, which is one of the early children's museums in the country. And at a very young age, I was very accustomed to working with kids from different backgrounds. It seemed normal to me partly because of my mom's leadership. And I also was around somebody who was an entrepreneur, who saw problems and took the opportunity and initiative to address them. And it just seemed to me a very normal thing to do. When I grew up, I went to the public schools in Milwaukee, in a place called Shorewood, Wisconsin, just outside Milwaukee. And a significant experience for me, to give you a sense of how I came to this work, was when I was a high school senior at this public high school in Wisconsin in 1984. And I was a sports editor of our high school newspaper. Loved sports, loved writing. It was a good job for me in addition to being a student. And there was a student, a first-year student, a freshman student, a girl who I had talked to was brilliant, was savvy, insightful. She wanted to write a story for our high school newspaper. I said, great, and this kind of insight, of course we want that. She submitted a draft to me in the editorial board, and I looked at the draft, and the other members of the editorial board looked at it, and they laughed. And the comment was, John, how could you think that, quote, someone like this could write a story for our newspaper? This girl, brilliant, insightful, savvy, had gone to the Milwaukee public schools through the 8th grade and then come to our high school in the 9th grade and had never learned how to write effectively. Never learned grammar, never learned how to have main ideas supported by the right kind of evidence and detail, how to organize an essay. All this brilliance had not been channeled into being able to write a story for our paper, much less unlocking her opportunities, because she hadn't been taught well in the Milwaukee public schools. And I don't mean this as a slam specifically on the Milwaukee public schools, because what I learned at that time, soon enough, was that this was a window onto where we were in education across the country in many cases. And I decided as a 17-year-old, I had to know more. Why was this the case? So I went and started visiting Milwaukee high schools as a student reporter and writing stories about what was being done and wasn't being done. And I read the newspaper headlines about the so-called reforms in the Milwaukee schools, none of which seemed to me to actually get manifested in the change in practices in the classrooms to actually help kids like the freshman student that I was working with succeed. And I tried to help this girl write a story for our paper. I worked with her for months on her writing and made some impact, but realized pretty quickly the limits of what I could do as one person, certainly as another student. It gave me tremendous respect for the teaching profession to understand what kind of task and work teachers have to help a large-scale number of students across the map master what they need to succeed. But it also made me realize that no one person could succeed at this alone. I began very interested in what we could do to help many, many, many girls like this girl and boys get the education they needed to succeed. So it set me on a lifelong quest to figure out how could I, as a kid from the suburbs of Milwaukee, a public school kid from Wisconsin, what could I do to help contribute to really changing outcomes for girls like this girl and her peers across the country? That set me off on this pursuit. I then spent time in the policy world. I've seen myself as a real connector of policy and practice. I've really been interested in understanding some of the most significant lessons learned from classrooms and schools across the country, including when we're seeing incredible successes, trying to help translate the lessons learned from those successes to inform large-scale policy making and systems change. I think there's been too little information flow between policy and practice both ways, and through a lot of my work, which I can talk about, I've tried to help create that flow of information. And I am convinced, as I've now more than a couple decades into this work, that every problem and challenge we've got in education is being solved by somebody in education somewhere. And the question is, how do we support that and take that to much larger scale so that we go from pockets of excellence to systems and really communities and states and nations of excellence? So where are we in that pathway? The US 35 years ago was #1 in the world in educational performance. #1 in the world, including in the percentage of young people who graduated from high school, the percentage of 25 to 34-year-olds with post-secondary degrees. We were wildly inequitable. We were suboptimal in many ways, but we led the world. Since then, the US has fallen to the middle of the pack among industrialized countries. 14th in the percentage of young people with post-secondary degrees. We've gone from #1 to number 14. 22nd in the percentage of our young people with high school degrees. We've gone from #1 to number 22. And interestingly and significantly, it's actually not because we've gotten worse. And some of you know this, but I think this is important framing to where we are. We've actually made some progress. We've actually had some improvements since 30 or 40 years ago. It wasn't that we had this glory day of American education and the schools all failed and we got to get back to that. The challenge is that we made a little progress and the world's changed. Because of a globalized economy, a technology-driven economy, an information society, the bar has been raised dramatically for what our young people need to know in order to be able to succeed and get good jobs and have the tools that they can lead families and lead communities and make more opportunities available for citizens in their community and across the country. One piece of data I think that highlights this, in 1973, 1 in 4 US jobs required some kind of post-secondary education, 1 in 4. At that point, basically, a high school degree was the ticket to a middle-class job, which then became a ticket to actually having a middle-class lifestyle and giving people the freedom and the opportunity to pursue the American dream. Today, nearly 2 in 3 US jobs require a post-secondary degree. This has been a seismic shift in a pretty short amount of time. Today, the ticket to a middle-class job is a post-secondary degree of some kind. Now, it may be a 4-year degree, it may be a 2-year degree, it could be a really high-quality certificate training program for even a year in some cases, but the ticket to a middle-class job typically is a post-secondary degree. And our incremental progress hasn't kept pace. There have been some other countries that have made dramatic strides in the past few decades that have kept pace. We've got some individual schools and programs that have kept pace, but at scale in this country, we haven't kept pace. Excuse me. So the question then is not, sometimes there's a debate between those who would say, oh, our schools have failed. What do we do to fix the failing schools of America? Not so. And there are those who might say, hey, don't blame us. The status quo is, we're as good as we've ever been, maybe better. So what are we all worked up about? That's wrong too. The question is collectively, what do we need to do to raise the bar in terms of expectations and performance to reach this new bar that the economy has thrust upon us? If our kids are going to have the access to the American dream that has been a cornerstone to the American promise for a very long time. So where are we against that? I think we have made some significant strides in the past 20 years that I think have not yet closed this opportunity gap or seized this opportunity, but I think are important to recognize as building blocks on which we can build our work in education in the coming years and decades. And again, people in this room have played significant roles in that. But number one, I think has been very important. I think there have been some states, Massachusetts, I see Paul here, which took a real lead in creating and codifying much higher expectations in the form of really rigorous academic standards to say, you know what? All of our kids can achieve at high levels. And we ought to have not just standards for inputs, but standards for outputs and outcomes and create an entire system aligned to much higher expectations for all of our kids. That seems like an obvious point now. But when Paul and you all in Massachusetts got going on that a while back, that wasn't an obvious point at the time. There were a few states that led the way. And that was continued across Democratic and Republican administrations. And today I would say that the culmination of that in the US policymaking today is the Common Core of standards and assessments, which many of you are familiar with, which really has been a state-led effort with Massachusetts playing a leading role with other states to really replace a lot of the watered-down standards across the country and old-style, not-so-great fill-in-the-bubble tests with a much more rigorous college-ready, career-ready standard and expectation with more meaningful assessments that actually measure what we need to know about how our kids are doing in order to help improve education in terms of how well kids can read and understand complex text deeply, how well can they write effectively, which the girl that I met back in Shore, Wisconsin couldn't do, how well can kids reason, how well can they apply those kind of skills to solving problems. These are things that have not always been what we've shot for in our standards and testing, but this Common Core, not a silver bullet, but is a culmination of a couple decades of work of standards and assessments in the making that I think is very significant. Number two, in the last 20 years, we've had a significant increase in the number of schools and programs, particularly those serving low-income kids, that have really made dramatic improvement in student outcomes for low-income kids. And 20 years ago, when someone said, oh, kids from low-income backgrounds can achieve at high levels with the right adult expectations and relationships and support, that was often greeted as idealism at best and folly at worst. Schools that were celebrated only 20 years ago, 25 years ago sometimes, for serving low-income kids, sometimes were celebrated in the movies when better discipline was brought to a school with no focus on actually student learning and student achievement that would prepare those kids for success in school. And we've had a significant growing number of schools across the country and programs that actually are demonstrating that when we adults get it right, that kids, including low-income kids, reach much, much higher levels than people have imagined to prepare them for success. Not perfection, but a growing number. And the third thing I think we've had happen is we've got a significantly growing evidence base from the research and practice about what works and what doesn't work. And we could go in, and many of you in this institution, in this hall, know a lot about that, but we have an evidence base that's very significant that we didn't know 20 years ago. And that's available in ways that it wasn't 20 years ago. I see Kim Marshall here, and Kim is a terrific educational leader in Boston who I've had the opportunity to work with, who among his other claims to fame created the Marshall Memo. And if you haven't got access to the Marshall Memo, you ought to Google it and look it up, because it sort of synthesizes weekly what we're learning from the research and evidence in a way that Kim is doing a great job on that, but it wouldn't have been possible 20 years ago with to the degree it is now with the level of evidence that we're gaining about what's working. Fourth and lastly, I think the most positive trend I've seen is that we have had a focus on solutions in education being embraced by a growing number of leaders across sectors. We've got a growing number of educational leaders, of civic leaders, of elected leaders, of business leaders, of labor leaders, who really are focused on, look, what do we do to take all of this to solve educational problems at large scale? And sometimes there's disagreements, and that, look, this is a vibrant American democracy, wouldn't be successful without disagreements. But the bottom line is that we have leaders at large scale focused, believing we can solve this problem, working on it, and that's one of the things that gives me great hope for doing what I think is the next chapter of American education, which is then how, given the situation about outcomes, and I could spend some time talking about the achievement gap outcomes that you all know so well, where we've got low-income and minority kids who are 3 or 4 grade levels behind their peers. We've got low-income kindergartners who have today have a 1 in 10 chance of completing college at a time when a post-secondary degree is essential to our future. So we both have broad gaps where we are as a country, but very, very, very disturbing and dangerous achievement gaps for low-income kids and kids of color and kids who've been underserved as well. But given where we are in the outcomes with all the challenges we've got, given the progress we've made, the question is what's next in American education? What are the big opportunities and challenges? And what I would say is there are a few huge needs and opportunities, and I'll connect that to some policy making and some nonprofit work. Number one, we have to go from school level proof points of success to entire cities and states that are getting really dramatic improved outcomes overall and closing gaps for low-income kids at large scale. And look, Massachusetts, you're in a state that has been, made more strides than really just about any state in the country in this. And that's a credit to the long-term persistent effort you've had here. But even in Massachusetts, you're not where you need to be, particularly in getting low-income kids to close the gap and get the successes they need at large scale. So I think problem number one to solve is how do we go from school-level proof points to scale proof points across entire communities and states where we're improving dramatic outcomes for all kids and closing achievement gaps for low-income kids. I think if in 10 years we can come back, and just as today we can point to the number of individual schools and school networks that are delivering great results, and we can point to 5 or 10, some people would say this is not ambitious enough, but I think this would be transformative. If we could have 5 or 10 communities and states that showed how at scale, what a US version of large-scale system change is like, that would be getting the kind of outcomes that we're seeing in places like Singapore or Shanghai or Finland to some extent, although I've been to Finland recently, and I think there's some questions about what the future is in Finland. I think they're doing well, but I think that there's some complacency there, which I think is putting their reforms at risk. But if we can create some U.S. versions of that, that will be a giant accomplishment. And I think the kind of preparation that many of you at Harvard are getting, and that others who are working on education at the classroom and school level, the lessons you're learning by what's working at the classroom and school level, and then you take those lessons learned to be able to serve as associate superintendents, and for those of you who are civic leaders who are working with communities, I think that is just a giant opportunity and need in the next 10 years that those of you who are working on, I think if you can be part of that, it'll make a lasting impact on the entire future of America and the opportunity we provide our kids. Second thing I think we need to do is to institutionalize the higher expectations for kids. And just to comment on this, when I've been in schools, in classrooms across the country, when I at New Leaders for New Schools, which I co-founded and Kim was part of and Vanessa's here is part of, we got lots of advice from this institution when I was a student here and created with a team of education school students and business school students, New Leaders, out of an independent study project that was an education school project with Paul Revel as an advisor. We had this, we created this selection process for principals, and we, in that selection process, realized what we've seen in classrooms and schools across the country. That is that we have a pervasive set of low expectations for kids in this country, particularly low-income kids, kids of color, kids who've been underserved, but actually for all kids. Our expectations simply are too low. We all care about our kids deeply. Parents care about our kids deeply. Teachers care about our kids deeply. When you actually look at the expectations in terms of student work that kids are asked to do, when you hear the type of questions that kids are being asked in the classroom or at home, when you hear the language that's being used to describe to kids what it is that they might know or might be able to learn or not, in very concrete ways, there's evidence of an epidemic of low expectations for our kids, despite great caring for kids. And why is that? How could we have such caring for kids in the country, and such great belief and aspiration in our kids, and have such low expectations? I think a key part of that is that comes back to our outcomes over the last 30, 40 years. We've made modest improvement. The bar has gone way up because of changes in the economy. And I think we've been busy. I think people haven't realized the new bar that it's going to take to help our kids succeed in this economy and this information age, and people get complacent. 80% of Americans think our schools are in crisis in the country. So you might think, oh, there's an urgency. But 80% of parents think that their kids' schools are doing just fine. And I've seen that. I've sat around roundtables with parents, middle-class parents, low-income parents, and I ask them, they have big goals for their kids, most of which require 4-year degrees, 2-year degrees, and I ask them how well are their kids' schools preparing them for success, and this backs up the data, but I've sat around with middle-income parents, low-income parents. The vast majority of them say their schools are preparing their kids just fine for that success. And in fact, I know these are schools where the schools aren't bad. This is not, some people I know will hear this. I know what people think. Here John goes in terms of being negative or bashing schools by saying this, and I'm not doing that. I think there's no harder job in the world, no more important job than the teaching job, the principal job as well. There's no more noble cause. Teachers in this country are hardworking. This is not a problem of like teacher or principal motivation in this country. We got hardworking people who want the best for our kids. But we're in a system where the bar has been raised, and we haven't, as a nation or a state or school system or school in most cases, organized ourselves to set higher expectations and help people achieve those. So we're left with a legacy of low expectations that might have made sense several decades ago, but don't make sense now. So it's not a critique. We've made some progress. It's actually amazing what teachers and principals are accomplishing, given the fact that we haven't been more organized about supporting them. And parents are working very hard and doing the best for kids, but parents are busy. Parents don't realize all the changes and the things that they could be doing for kids either. So it's not negative. It's just that we've got to, in a very blame-free way, inform ourselves, this is the new era, this is the new age, what are we going to do to lift our expectations, and then face up to what we need to do to solve for that. And I think we can talk about a lot of specific policy solutions and a lot of specific instructional solutions, a lot of specific systems change solutions, and we're all deep into all those. But I think if we don't address this basic lens about the need for much higher expectations, I think every one of those is going to be co-opted by sometimes a culture of replication of the status quo or of compliance, as opposed to looking at how we get better expectations and better outcomes for our kids. I think this is an essential lens to shift. One other kind of data piece to support this need for, this high expectations we have, but not actually matching the reality. In fact, this is in Dick Murnane's book. Kathy and I were just talking about the book Wither Opportunity, a very powerful book, by the way, with incredible data on where we are as a country in education. It's a long book, but it's very important. 90% of 8th graders expect to complete a 4-year degree. 90%. 80% of 12th graders expect to complete a 4-year degree. We've done some surveys showing 90% of parents expect their kids will get a 4-year degree, and barely 30% do. So by the time that kids are at the point where they see how things go on, the majority of people who expected they'd be getting a 4-year degree, they, or if your parents, their kids, aren't getting it, and they realize too late the truth about what it takes. And then we repeat that cycle over and over, again, because this higher bar has been created that we haven't informed ourselves about. So I think getting the higher expectations and then finding ways to institutionalize that in a way that is not punitive but supportive is absolutely crucial. I do think the Common Core as a policy effort, the Common Core assessments and standards and significantly rich curricula aligned to the Common Core are a significant part of that. I think there are other efforts too. So one thing we need to do is go from school level proof points to city and state level proof points of success. Number 2 is we've really got to move from low expectations to much higher expectations, both in our personal lens and our cultural lens, as well as through policy mechanisms. Third thing I think we need to do is to invest deeply in our teaching profession, in our teaching and school leadership profession. In the end, there is no greater factor inside schools to lift up student success than the quality of teaching. And there's no great school that can sustain quality teaching without quality principals and quality school leaders. And by the way, you can't sustain quality principals and scale without, Kim and I were just talking about this, without the instructional leaders who are supporting the principals in educational systems. And so I really think we have to reinvent a teaching and school leadership career that really both attracts our top talent into teaching, that find ways to retain and then develop those significant ways, not only through training. Training is important but overrated. I think that part of what we learned is the best training development happens when you have the right management and the right support and coaching that's job embedded when people are doing their job as a teacher and doing their job as a principal. And instead of going off to one-shot training, and some of you know this, but we actually have structures to actually develop people's skills as part of their work. Doesn't mean you can't get out of school too. You need to do some of that too. But the development you get on the job, is, if it's done right, is as important as the training that you can get outside the job. And I think we have to reinvent our career ladders to give people opportunities to move into all kinds of roles where you as a teacher, once you demonstrate that you're good, and it takes some time, can become lead teachers and instructional coaches and curriculum leaders. Singapore and Shanghai do this, where they've created just career ladders for good teachers to take on all kinds of roles, and often without leaving the classroom, where you become a half-time teacher or a three-quarter-time teacher, and you have the opportunity to shape other teachers' practice too. And I think if in this age where people are used to changing careers and jobs, 7 to 15 times, if we don't create opportunities for educators to be able to try out different things without leaving education, and sometimes without leaving the classroom, I don't think we're going to hold on to or leverage their expertise in a way that we need to support other teachers. I think we need some massive policy change in order to make this possible. I think we need some massive redesign of job roles in school systems. I think we need a cultural shift that can focus on what it takes to attract and retain great teachers. But interesting, when you look at where this starts, and I'm happy to go into some more detail on this in a few minutes in Q&A. I spent time talking with Andreas Schleicher at the OECD, who's looked at countries across the world who've made progress in really professionalizing teaching. What's interesting, I actually had thought, and this is the danger of coming to conclusions without data, I had thought, before I had any data on this, that probably the right place to start on this was changing the culture in terms of how teaching was valued in our country. And I thought, what if we as a country really said, we're going to make teaching the most respected profession? And that's going to lead to big change. Turns out, Andreas, who studied changes across educational systems across the world, says that actually that's not how the countries that have made big changes have done it. They've actually made changes in the structure of the teaching profession, in what the job is like, and what the career is like. And then the respect from the culture has then followed what's been done to change the actual job and the career of teaching, which is a very, I think, significant point. And it's not that I don't think we need more cultural focus and attachment to teaching. I think we do, and we need more parents and grandparents to be thrilled that their kids are going to go into teaching. But I think it's not going to succeed fully unless we change the job and the career of teaching and school leadership to make it the most attractive place it can be for people who are willing to work hard and willing to take coaching and willing to take feedback, and who are not only going to care about kids, but care about kids' outcomes and feel on the hook and be on the hook for improving outcomes for the kids they serve. And we can talk about measurement, but measured in a fair way. I don't want to be mechanistic about this, but people who really feel like they want to be in position with support to take responsibility for better outcomes for kids at scale. That is tough. We have salary problems today. We have bureaucratic structural problems today. We have labor management contracts that are outdated in some cases. We've got school board regulations that are outdated. We've got cultures in education that are more about sometimes cultures of compliance because they were created to be bureaucratic cultures deliberately a century ago that haven't been changed. But we have to really look at how do we change education in order to make things work for supporting outstanding teachers at scale, in order to equip those people to support kids at scale. I think the last thing I'll say that we think we need, if one is going from school level proof points to city level proof points, number two is going from low expectations to pervasive high expectations, and three is really transforming teaching and school leadership. The fourth thing I really think we do need, which also has not gotten as much attention as it should, and President Obama has talked about this, but I think this is not a role for the federal government, is parents. I think it's a question of how do we empower parents in this country, challenge parents and empower parents to be the best parents they can be in order to help their kids to succeed. And this is not, we cannot use this as an excuse in schools and as educators to say we can't make progress without parents. We can. It's very clear that with the right policies and the right supports, investments, the right leadership mostly at the school level and system level, we can make changes in schools. There's also issues outside schools that are very important, but we can make improvements in schools. So this is not an excuse for not making improvements in schools. But I do think we've got to look for ways to actually challenge and support parents to raise the bar in terms of expectations for their kids and to engage in ways that are helpful in their kids' learning so that parents become allies in raising the bar, as opposed to sometimes parents are AWOL and absent. And sometimes we have parents, and I am a parent of 3 kids, and I love my kids, and now I have a parental lens that I didn't have before our first child was born 7 years ago. Sometimes parents are actually getting involved in the wrong way and actually complaining when the standard gets raised. When their kid gets a bad grade and they complain to the teacher instead of saying, hey, thanks for the feedback, what can we do to improve this? And I think if we don't get parents more engaged, we won't give kids the engagement they need at home. Parents, or in some cases guardian or grandparent, it can be any adult who kids are cared for. And I don't think we're going to get the demand for higher bar in education that we need without ultimately the parents and the students whose interests depend on a better education asking for it. I think the supply of good efforts we've got in schools won't continue. The work that needs to be done won't be sustained over time without the right kind of responsible demand for improvements that can come from parents who are empowered and engaged and challenged to support their kids in ways that we all aren't. And I'd say there are some very concrete examples of this. I'm interested in some looking at research that's been done, but I'd like more research to be done on parents, including middle-class parents. Now, I think the mobile device issue, I think, and I haven't seen research on this, has probably reduced significantly the amount of interaction and conversation between parents and kids. I spend time at playgrounds, I spend time in different places, and you see the parents on the mobile phone of the kids. I don't mean to pin this all on this, but I think actually looking at some habits and saying what can we do to change those is going to be an important ingredient. So what's going to this is going to take? I'm basically, I think we need these 4 big things that need to get done, and there are more outside of education, and I'm not going to go into this tonight. But we have to know that sometimes people debate: do schools need to be improved, or do we need to address other issues like poverty? We need both. We need good health care and accessible health care for kids. We need on poverty, we need to have family support for low-income families. We need housing. We need job improvements. Sometimes you get caught in these debates, but I was saying earlier, it's like if my wife and I were to argue, should we focus on giving our kids a nutritional dinner and breakfast, or should we get them a good night's sleep? We should do both. We should focus on improving schools, and we should be tackling poverty more generally. And if we're not making progress enough in one area, we ought to be uniting with others to make progress on both. But in light of what we need to do, I think that in the end, the federal government has a role to play. And in the Q&A, I'll talk more about the president. I think the president has played a big role championing both educational improvements and health improvements and family support improvements that are very, very important for kids. But the president knows in this, and he said this again and again, he knows that as important as the reforms and the investments that he and Arne Duncan have called for and are calling for now, from early learning to K-12 to post-secondary to health care to family support, that in the end, that the real power lies in our communities and states across the country. and he can champion reforms, he can make some investments, but the federal government only spends 10 cents on the dollar on K-12 education. It's true in many other areas as well. So the question is, with the right policy that's been said, and the president will be calling for more in the second term, can community and state leaders say we're taking responsibility to really ratchet up what we're going to do? And I think that probably the key players in education in the coming years are going to be the local superintendents, the principals, the teachers, the state superintendents, the state boards of education, the governors, the school board members, the teacher union leaders, and can those individuals and parents take responsibility individually and in networked ways collectively? Can they take responsibility for really introducing both the kind of reforms and the investments and the long-term persistence that's needed so that we can go in the next 10 years from our school level successes to successes at city and statewide? And I think that the first places that do that, the first communities and states that do that with the right local and state leadership from all those players and civic leaders, and there's a role for faith leaders and others, I think have an opportunity to create models of large-scale success that when we come back in the year 2020, that we will be able to nationally point to and say, this is what we have to do all across America in a way that really can brighten the future for all of our kids. But sometimes people talk about race to the top. I think the real race to the top is going to depend on all of our kids and all of our communities winning this race. But in order to get there, we need some communities and states to really show what this looks like at scale. And for those of you who are listening here in the audience and on through technology, if you can be part of making those efforts happen in your community and your state, one school at a time, one classroom at a time, in entire systems, you will literally help us move from a 20th century education system that may have worked for us in the 20th century to a 21st century education system that can really unlock the American dream for all of our kids. It's really up to you, and I'm one person who's going to keep my shoulder to the wheel in that as well. So with that, let me close and open it up for questions, feedback, rebuttals, and discussion. Yes.
Thank you very
Good to see
much, Eve Sullivan, an alum. I was all set to complain because I thought you weren't going to mention parents, and I'm so grateful. I don't know whether you saw me cheering. I do parenting education in my copious spare time, and it is important, and it is neglected. So how can we work together? I just wrote, and in fact today published with the International Federation for Parenting Education, a call for universal parenting education, also with a colleague in India co-signing. So there's much to be done, and thank you very much for your work. No complaints.
Well, we got a lot of work ahead, but I thank you for your leadership on that, and I would love to talk more. I think that there are some nascent programs that are really interesting. I think the implication for what we need to do in terms of programming to support parents, I think in terms of policy, in terms of organizing, I think is significant. So I'm going to, anybody who wants, in fact, let me just give it right now, my email address for anybody who wants, and if you'd email me, I'd love to talk more. My email address is jon.schnur, jon.schnur at americaachieves.org. So it's jon.schnur@americaachieves.org. Also encourage you to take a look at our website, which is www.americaachieves.org. It's early on, but it's got some pretty good stuff on it. We'd love your feedback, and we'd love to correspond more with you and others.
Hello, Mr. Schnur. So I am the sort of digital surrogate. All the people watching online and submitting questions and comments. I'm going to read a comment from Nathan Cleckley, who's watching in Boston. He writes, at the end of your talk, he said, feeling better about our education system. Thank you. So that's the comment. And then a question was on your comment about Finland. You mentioned complacency, and they were curious what specific examples of complacency and what would you say to the Minister of Education in Finland to prevent that?
Thank you, Nathan and Matt, for that question. As I said, that came out of my mouth, I realized I don't know that I would have planned to have made that comment. I don't mean it as a disparaging comment. Finland is known for its leading the world on some global education measures, including the PISA exam, and they've done a very, very good job in Finland in many ways, including they've invested really in some pretty impressive early learning and childcare for kids with very significant investment in that. They've invested in making the teaching profession more selective and creating some institutions that are really rigorous in terms of preparing teachers for teaching. They've created, actually before we did in some ways, some standards and curricula for the country that were more rigorous. And so they went from being pretty good in education, and they improved over the course of a couple decades to, by some measures, #1, and some not quite at #1 in the world. And so they've done a lot of good things, and so I don't. That's not a disparagement at all. But what I would say is, I think there's always a risk of complacency in an era when kind of the bar keeps getting higher because of our changes in our economy and our world. I was in Finland this summer, and while I learned a lot from Finland, I think there's some very impressive educators in Finland. My biggest worry about Finland, honestly, is just something I think is a real risk in many places, was complacency. And I think that to the Minister of Education, I would say, don't get people, your public fooled by a #1 measure. That's, you can easily go to #3 and 5. In fact, some of the latest measures since then have actually already indicated a slight drop. And I think the moment you take your eye off the ball of improvement and what are we doing well, what are we not doing well, how do we keep getting better, I think you lose momentum and improvement. And I think that complacency is probably the greatest risk in Finland. I also would say, I'll just use that, Nathan's good question, as a jumping off point to make a related point that we often, those people who are working from a mission-driven perspective for low-income kids focus on the achievement gaps for low-income kids, and that's very, very important. I also think we've got a complacency gap in which we talked about generally, but I want to specifically mention for middle-class students in this country on middle-class schools. I think sometimes people think that education is a function of poverty. Sometimes it's done in a very damaging way, in the sense that if you're poor, you can't learn high levels. But sometimes people are very responsible about that and say, look, kids can learn a course innately, but if they're poor, then maybe that makes circumstances hard for them to learn. And there are schools that have demonstrated you can make great progress, even while non-school investments are important too. But we also, sometimes there's a belief that our middle-class kids are doing okay. And our middle-class kids, again, I think we've seen progress over the years, no question. Our kids are doing a lot of work, our teachers are working hard, but the bar has been raised, and there's data that's been coming out that I think has not gotten enough publicity yet globally, showing that we've got middle-class kids who are lagging behind their peers globally. And I think that complacency about how we're doing in middle-class schools is risks, just like in Finland, I think risks us not making the investments and the improvements we need to make sure that middle-class and working-class families across the country have kids get the education they need to succeed and contribute to our economy. So I think that complacency problem is in Finland, but I think we also have it here, including for middle-class kids. Next question.
Thank you, John, for your reflections on high expectations. I can really attest to that as a teacher, and now as a school administrator, and now as a school leadership program graduate student. I'm curious about the shape of reform in our country concerning our poor kids in particular, and that most of the reform efforts are increase the school day, increase the amount of time spent on reading and doing mathematics. But when I look at how the business world is advancing through innovative designs like Google's 20% time of creativity, can you speak a little bit to how we overprescribe like the school day to poor kids? Because that even maybe alludes to your idea of like middle class families. Like there's a lot of work now around how we are oversubscribing our students and not allowing them to think creatively or develop this independence that companies like Google have really leveraged to our advantage as consumers to actually communicate better with each other.
Thank you for those great questions. And as I hear it, there are two related questions there that I'll respond to. One, and they're related, but one is around the extended school day question, and does efforts to extend the school day, does that make sense, given that I gather implicit in your question is if the school is focusing on a more academic content, then does that not give kids the opportunity for outside of school opportunities of different sorts? And then secondly, your question is, in this era where we've got such a need for creativity and problem solving, does a focus on just basic skills or implicitly maybe more rote learning, is that going to be successful for kids and for our economy if we don't get to the higher order thinking, the critical thinking skills, the creativity? Both great questions. And there's, again, a lot of expertise in this room and through technology for people who are watching this, but I'll give you my perspective on your two good questions. First of all, on extended learning, I do believe that when when you have good teaching, and that extending the school day, particularly for kids who've been behind, low-income kids, kids who've been underserved, is a really good idea. I think you often have kids who are 3 or 4 grade levels behind, and asking the students and the teachers to catch up in the same amount of time is not only doesn't accomplish the goal, but it puts there's a risk sometimes that we put lots of pressure on people to do better without the support and the time and the opportunity to get better, and I think that's an example of it. I think some of the most successful schools that we've seen have had good teaching and then extended days and extended years in order to capitalize on that. I think the risk is with extended learning programs, and there are people in the audience and elsewhere who I respect who might agree or disagree, but I think the risk is that when you just focus on extended day without actually having the real quality teaching the kids need, you often then have kids get more of the same in places that maybe it's not what they need in the first place. And if it's not really working in the first place, giving the kids more time and more access to that same thing isn't a solution. So like in lots of things in education, I think there's a risk of going to scale too fast. So in extended learning, and I think Massachusetts has had some really good work done on this. And again, Paul's got tremendous leadership and expertise in this. I think the key has been, when do you actually make sure there's a focus on quality teaching and extending the day where that quality teaching is then given more time to work with kids. And by the way, making it possible in extended day programs to actually not have to choose between reading and math instruction to catch kids up who are a few years behind, and the science and social studies and arts and other education. Sometimes in a shorter day, if you got kids a few years behind, there's a pressure on schools to focus on how to catch kids up in some of the kind of the most basic academic areas and important academic areas. The extended day can give you the opportunity to not have to make that choice, but it costs money, and that's part of why we as a country, I think, have to invest the right money, both in quality and time. The second question, in terms of sort of basic skills versus creativity, higher order problem solving skills, I think is a really important one. And the way I would put it is that it's a both and. So I do think that even in reading and math, sometimes people can quickly dismiss those as sort of more basic skills, but as you all know who are educated, you're a teacher, you know this. To really help a child learn how to really read deeply and to really understand and to really write and communicate effectively is no basic skill. To be able to read a book and sound out the words is a basic critical skill, but to really take complex text, to read text like embedded in this Common Core, written from different perspectives, and be able to analyze where the author's coming from different perspectives, and write an essay with supporting evidence that can communicate your analysis or your perspective on something. These are not basic skills. These are high-order skills that we all need in order to succeed in the world, and I think are really important. I think sometimes, if we're not doing that right, it is shortchanging kids, and both in terms of the reading ability and in the kind of knowledge and skill they'll need to be creative and to apply that to other spheres. Similarly in math, in some ways math is just a language for, and there are mathematics expertise in the room, but math is a language for really good problem solving and analytic skill. I mean, it's a way of just thinking in a way that actually helps you reason and solve problems. I think is very powerful. And so it can be a basic skill if it's just rote learning, but math done right is really learning how to think in a different way and apply that in solving problems. I think is just crucial. So I just think that even just reading and math done right, as embedded in this Common Core of standards, and standards the easy part, teaching is the harder part, but getting that taught to kids will, I think, actually not only help kids do reading and math well, but actually will help kids acquire the knowledge and the thinking skills that can actually lay the foundation for, for problem solving and for creativity. That said, if we have schools that only focus on kids reading and even writing and doing math well, we are going to shortchange our kids. And we need other subject area expertise and teaching, and giving kids opportunities to solve problems, to think critically, to work in groups and sort of solve problems collaboratively in the way that you often have to in the workplace, in order to have opportunities to sort of creatively approach problems and solve and look at opportunities for figuring out how things can be differently is critical. And I do think there's a risk, if we're not careful, and because this has happened in some cases, where we're so focused on the skills that can be measured by the assessments around reading and math that we actually shortchange the other. And it just shows it's a both and, which I would just end with saying, like on so many of these questions in education, it is a both and, which just means that's why teaching is such a hard job. And that's why we ought to be doing so much to support our teachers. And that's why I think we ought to have more investment in education. Because in most of these cases, in order to prepare kids well, including per your question, it's a both and. And we ought to acknowledge that in our work as people in the country and as policymakers too. Yes?
Hi. Thank you for your comments. I found them very interesting. My name is Lindy Amato. I'm Director of Professional Affairs at the Ontario Teachers Federation in Toronto, Canada. And if you think you insulted Finland by saying they were getting a bit complacent, you didn't even mention Canada, so imagine how I feel. But my question actually, I have a question and then a comment that was tied to the last speaker. But you know, in Canada, we have done, in the province of Ontario, but also in some other provinces in our country, we have done a lot of work on raising achievement levels, closing the achievement gaps, and we've done remarkably well. And I'm curious about what you think it is we're doing and why it's working for us that is not working here. As an example, in Ontario, we have, I think, something like 90% of our students are in publicly funded schools, which is not obviously the case here. We have next to nothing really resembling a true private university system in Canada. Most of our universities are publicly funded, or as our professors like to say, publicly assisted. And so we have most of our students who are university bound are in publicly funded universities. So I'm just curious where the mismatch is, if you consider that our countries are next door to each other and in many ways very similar. Why it looks so different, and that's something I'm really trying to understand and not really getting very far at. The last thing that I just wanted to say quickly about the focus on reading and writing and all of that is that I think part of what is happening both here in Canada and many other countries is that we've not done a tremendously good job of defining what we mean by education success. Everybody thinks they know what we're talking about when we're talking about school success. But I would say if you take a look at the number of students who are exhibiting, displaying symptoms of mental health issues, we're not really looking carefully enough at what's happening to our students in our schools. We need to think a lot about where we are, what is the destination of our students. It's not always going to be found in the college system. We have a whole system of community colleges in Canada. We find many of our students are not going to those trades and community colleges where they would learn many, many skills that would make their lives very meaningful. And that has nothing to do with having lower expectations for them. So I think my last comment really has to do with really looking at what we mean when we say school success, and have we really defined it, and whose definition are we using? Go ahead.
Two great questions. On the first, you may have some expertise to offer on the first one. So if you want to you give your perspective on what we should learn from Ontario, I'd be interested to hear it. But I can give you my perspective. Look, I think that a couple points. I think on your Ontario question, I think that some improvements and some of the successes, not all across Canada, although Canada's had some real improvements, particularly in that region, have been really impressive. And actually, I think sometimes we talk about the Asian countries or in Europe, but I think closer to home, that particular region in Canada has made some real strides that I think are well worth understanding. I've been there, I've got a little sense, I haven't studied enough to be really confident in my assessment and my analysis, but what I would say from what I've read and heard from people who've been in that system, it seems to me that there have been a few factors there that are highly relevant to our work. One is you had educational leadership and civic and elected leadership that really focused significantly on improving outcomes for kids in the region and stuck with it for a long time. Like, it was not a short-term effort. And Massachusetts has too, by the way. I mean, for all the gaps we talked about, Massachusetts has made big strides, and I think that confluence of elected leadership and civic leadership and educational leadership, sticking with it for a long time through ups and downs, I think in Massachusetts as well has been a key factor. In Ontario, it seems like it was too. I also think in Ontario, from what I can tell, is, and this is not as interesting to a very broad public audience, but I think it's important, and given the education audience here, you'll appreciate it. I think that the systems change efforts that were made in Ontario seem really important, that they really looked at how do you have all the various components of what is happening in education in Ontario aligned to a common vision, having goals, having the right curriculum, having the right professional development, having people really trained in that, and having culture to support it. They really were not just taking, from what I can tell, looking at one issue, but looking at how all this adds up in terms of systems change, and I think that's really important. I think that one mistake that we can make in the U.S. Is, and very often we can make this, is that we think there's some silver bullet. We think that, if you just had a better test, if you just had more time, if you just had better teacher training, if you just had more teacher salary, if you just had preschool, I mean, some of these things are things I believe in, but it'll make improvements. And that's not the case. In fact, I think some of the policy and philanthropic efforts have failed because they've been focused on a silver bullet, and they haven't focused on the long term. I think the lesson of Ontario, from what I can tell, is that the sticking at it for the long term, but really focusing on how you transform the entire system and then align everything to that, has been really critical, and I think we can learn a lot from that. The second question on outcomes and how you define outcomes, I think, is critical. Again, I think sometimes we get into these false debates in the U.S. on this. Right now, I feel like sometimes we've been in this debate of, let's focus on how kids are doing on tests and assessments. No, we shouldn't have tests or assessments, and it gets pretty simplified and unhelpful. And I think the bottom line is that we should very much focus on how kids do on high-quality assessments as one measure of a kid's success. And I think this is where the Common Core is not a cure-all, but actually having assessments that will be coming down the line in a couple of years that will really measure the kind of higher-order skills we're looking for. The ability to really comprehend deeply and write effectively and reason well, I think will be very important. But it should be able to be one measure. And I think that we should have measures around post-secondary success. And while you're right that not every student should go to a four-year college, I actually think that having goals for the percentage of young people coming out of an educational system that get into and complete a post-secondary degree of some kind, whether a four-year degree or a two-year degree or a one-year certificate training program, I think is a very, very important measure of success that we should be holding ourselves accountable for in education. And I think we need to look at, and this is a measurement question, there are other aspects of education that are so important that aren't picked up by those, including the Hewlett Foundation out of California is sort of talking about this as a deeper learning agenda, which partly is the kind of higher order mastery of content that's in the Common Core and some of the problem-solving skills, but partly it's around things like the ability to have an academic mindset, which is very important. Like, how do kids have the mindset around that actually it's effort that drives improvement and not just innate ability, or kind of collaborative skills that are in service of solving real problems and leveraging academic content, or critical thinking skills of different kinds, some of which are not measured in your academic content assessments. And I think that there is a need for looking at some kind of goal and measure around those kind of things. Maybe things like civic. I actually strongly believe civic education ought to be another one. But I think the two risks are there's the issues. One is we don't have the right measurements in many of those cases, and I think proceeding with something before we got the right measurement is dangerous. And so I think we need to make progress in measurement and then not make it overly mechanistic. And secondly, I think there's a risk that we get into a laundry list of goals and measures that become like the academic standards of today that are now have to be replaced. Right now we've got standards that are a mile wide and not deep, and then teachers are being asked to cover the waterfront. And if we're not careful, we could have the same thing in terms of goals and measures, where it's just not fair to ask people to focus on all of those things in a way that's being measured by in terms of just quality. So I think finding a way to focus and streamline a set of goals and measures that make sense in terms of academic skills and non-academic skills and attainment over time, but in a streamlined way, is one of the important tasks, I think, for education in the U.S. So thanks for your great question. Yes, next question.
Hi, John. Thanks so much for coming. My name is Paul Perry. I'm in the Doctor of Education Leadership program here. And I've heard Tony Wagner write convincingly about the importance of defining our problems properly in education. And I heard you use the phrase achievement gap a lot in your presentation. And it seems to be the buzz phrase that is sort of reigning in education reform circles today. And there's been a lot of backlash in scholarly circles to that phrase, or against that phrase rather. Asa Hilliard, Kamika Royal out of Philadelphia, Gloria Latson-Billings has her reframing of the education debt. And a lot of the scholarship has said that it's a phrase that blames historically marginalized populations for underachievement, that it holds the performance of white wealthy students as a standard of excellence without interrogating whether or not it should actually be worthy of comparison, and also that it only speaks of academic outcomes rather than the conditions that lead to those outcomes, and sometimes leads us to solutions that sort of ignore the conditions and prevents us from treating them in terms of the educational context. And I know Secretary Revel has written pretty extensively about non-school factors and the need to treat them in order to get to some of these outcomes that we all desire. So what do you think about the idea of reframing and maybe getting rid of that phrase, or and not just focusing on the semantics, but choosing a phrase or choosing a goal that doesn't narrow our methods and sort of opens up a broader array of options in terms of education reform?
So thank you for the thoughtful question. I think that we should have goals I think it's important to have goals around our kids really prepared, all of our kids, including those who've been historically underserved. Are they really prepared to be able to be successful in post-secondary degree, not just get in, but succeed in a post-secondary degree program? Are they able to succeed in kind of the high-skill, high-wage careers, which really will unlock opportunity for kids? And I think that that does require setting goals around outcomes for kids that include a focus on academic success. I also, for my last question, I think we ought to be looking at other goals as well. In fact, on the kind of what people call the non-cognitive side, I mean, there's been research, as some of you know in the room, that some of the qualities around like persistence and self-control wind up accounting for more of the differential impact in terms of college outcomes, for example, than IQ. And so I think that we do need a focus on goals that are not only focused on academic, but include academic goals. I also agree with you that we need to have strategies that don't just set goals, but that actually get to the root of, okay, if we have goals, what are the root of the problems that actually, what are the things that keep us from achieving those goals? How do we solve those problems? How do we invest in those things? And that includes things like building educator capacity to meet this higher bar. It includes I think very much in investing in, for example, mental health issues. I think I've been in, some very high poverty communities, and there are really some significant underinvested mental health issues that kids are bringing to school that really severely need support, and often we don't have the investments that we need in that then make it much harder to achieve those educational outcomes. I think are crucial. In fact, I think this is the mental health issues in communities of poverty around the country. I think are one of the most significant things that are not getting the attention that they should. I think is very, very important. So I agree with that. Now, when I was using in terms of language, when I was using the word achievement gap or opportunity gap, I was talking about the gap between where kids are and where they need to be in order to be successful in today's economy, in today's society. I think that for me, that language doesn't refute the first points. I mean, when I use that language, it's not saying that we ought not have broad goals for kids. It doesn't mean we ought not be investing in kind of the resources and the support to help them achieve. So you could have discussions about what the right language is, but as I use that language, that's not what it would get at. I think substantively what's important is I think people ought to unite around saying, in my view, we ought to have rigorous goals for our kids and then focus on how we're tracking progress to outcomes, and then actually making the investments and putting in the resources on both the academic side and the non-academic side in order to help kids achieve those. And if we do that, then I think the language, to me, is less of an important issue.
Thank you.
Hi, Mr. Schnur. Thank you for bringing up all these important points here. I want to thank you also for mentioning the part about the teacher career ladder questions. That's something I very much agree with him and interested in, but it always strikes me as being such a complex issue. Like changing the teacher career ladder would involve changing schools and classrooms and teacher training programs. And so I wonder, in your experience, what do you think are the best levers for experimenting with and promoting that kind of a change that would need to have so many components and so many aspects to it?
It's a great question. Thank you so much. So I think there have been some efforts to create career ladders or address pieces of that. I think that what's most important from my perspective is in a small number of communities in educational systems where there is pretty decent capacity that's been built up, both educator capacity and organizational capacity. By the way, on the Ontario question, I know that Michael Fullen, who's written about Ontario, has talked a lot about not only the capacity of individual educators, but how do you build up the organizational capacity in order to succeed at something. I think that is a very important point that often gets missed. In places that actually have developed pretty decent educator capacity and organizational capacity, I think that instead of just what many places have done is trying like one piece of a career ladder. So let's have some lead teachers, or let's have some extra pay for teachers who've done well or take on extra responsibility, or let's have some program where we get good teachers to become good principals. I mean, these are all good things, but I think that this to me is a systems issue, and a good example of a systems issue, so that instead of just taking on a couple pieces of that, I think in a small number of places that really are serious to look at how do you really redesign in every way kind of the ladder and the career for educators, I think is really important. And I have not seen, there may be some that have done it, including the people in this room have worked on or watching via technology have been working on or have researched, but I have not seen in the US a serious effort to soup to nuts say how to actually redefine the job and the career for educators based on what we know in terms of giving people opportunity for advancement and for development and for leveraging their skills in different ways, having compensation aligned to that, having criteria for selection for jobs be aligned to that, have job training aligned to that. I do think there are a few places abroad that have done that, and I think that tackling that soup to nuts in some high capacity, small number of systems can create some incredible models that I think could be adapted elsewhere in the US, and I think is more important than any narrowly defined career ladder reform. But it seems like you may have a background on that. I'd love to hear if you've got thoughts on that too.
No, I mean, I've never seen it specifically done. I always just sort of wonder how you would connect the pieces between what a school could do and, you know, what they're getting from, say, a teacher training program, and then how that might be reflected in school. I haven't seen any that were able to do this in this way. So
I'll tell you that you know, I haven't been, but what I've heard from I think it's Shanghai and Singapore have gotten some versions of those that have been created. I think they're not perfect, and again, I don't think every model from across the world should just be transplanted to the U.S. But from what I've heard about those models, that they are as close to what I'm talking about. And I think that, again, for people in this room or watching the technology, I think if you kind of can find ways to work on this, I really believe, since we know that the greatest in-school factor affecting student learning is the quality of teaching, we know that teachers just are not, you know, that you are not born, they're made over time. We know education's a team sport where you need support and expertise to be shared. That creating structures for educators to be able to develop and grow and leverage the expertise of other great educators in a systemic way seems to me like one of the best opportunities. There are some. I mean, I would say the teacher advancement program is one in the U.S. that I know has done a pretty nice job of doing some of these things, but I think that often these are not done both at the school level and the system level, as you're alluding to.
thank you.
Thank you. Yes.
Hi, thanks for coming. My name is David Rosenberg. I'm a neighbor of the school, and I happen to be a Teach for America staff member, so thank you for coming. So a question about this issue of teachers and teacher quality, but stepping back to sort of the broader narrative that's evolved, and I think part of the narrative around reform in education that has evolved for one reason or another is that there's reform and then there's teachers, and that those things are at odds in some way. And I think some of that may be because of things that have happened quite intentionally in terms of people saying, we need a different kind of teacher in the classroom or a different kind of school leader in the classroom. And some of it has been quite inadvertent, I suspect, among those of us reformers and how things have gotten framed over time. But I think we acknowledge that nothing happens sustainably without partnership of teachers who come through traditional paths, who've been in the classroom for 20 or 30 years, who've come from any path. And so as someone who's sort of clearly identified with the reform mindset and the reform movement, I'm wondering if you have any thoughts on how both we can change the narrative to the point where reform is about empowering and supporting teachers in pursuit of better outcomes for kids, but also how we can sort of overcome some of the challenges that have evolved over time and actually create those partnerships in ways that get past the sort of the political battles, which I think, to your point earlier, are quite oversimplified and very easy to sort of gravitate towards.
It's a great question. Thank you for the thoughtful question too. So I'll make a couple points about that. Number one is I have voted with my feet in deeply believing in the investment of the development and support of educators. Anybody who thinks that just somehow if the teachers were just more motivated in this country, we'd have kids do better, or we just pass some law that requires a higher standard that's going to solve things is badly mistaken. And in my 10 to 12 years of leading and having founded New Leaders for New Schools and leading that, our whole focus on how do you develop excellent educators to become really excellent instructional leaders who can then provide the kind of instructional support that teachers need to succeed. And we invested, in fact, some of the critique sometimes I've had for new leaders is that we invested too much in training and development. I just think that I didn't buy that, because I think that ultimately if we ask people to meet a much higher standard, which we have to because our kids need that, we have to then invest in the development of educators and instructional capacity and support to be able to do that. In my work in terms of policy, similarly when I helped President Obama and then Arne Duncan on the president's leadership on the stimulus bill in 2008, 2009, the president really, made this call for $100 billion out of the stimulus package going to education, including really averting major job cuts in education, saying how can you ask for improvement if you're cutting jobs, investments in professional development for teachers and preparation for teachers, as well as kind of higher standards and reform. And I think that mix on the policy front is important too. So I just think it's crucial. I think in terms of the, look, if you have high standards and accountability without investment and support to get there, it's not going to succeed. If you invest in support and development without having some high goals and some accountability, I think it's also not going to succeed. It is a both and, as you say. In terms of your question around the narrative, I know that for people who follow this, that you have this narrative sometimes about reform versus status quo, and I just think that's not a helpful framing. I think that people who are, we look in this country, we've got some terrific and amazing superintendents and some bad superintendents. We've got some terrific and amazing teacher union leaders, and we've got some bad teacher union leaders. We've got some terrific and amazing teachers and principals, and we've got some ones that aren't so good. We've got some terrific and great state superintendents and ones that aren't so good. And we've got a lot of people in the middle, I would say, who right now are very capable and who could reach a much higher, haven't had the right higher expectations and support for them to succeed. And sometimes we spend focus on finger pointing and blaming the superintendent or the union or somebody's got to make the change, as opposed to how do we lift all boats. And I think that's the right framing. I do think that there are people who benefit from the conflict narrative and who think that highlights certain principles that are very important. And I do believe that sometimes you have to have conflict, and sometimes standing on principle is very, very important, because sometimes and courageous leadership requires being willing to have conflict over the principle. But I don't think that the focus should be on the conflict. It should be focused on the principle and the policy, and then if somebody takes an aim at that, then that's fine. I'll tell you my last point, because I think we're about to close, that I think gets at this. We'll close with President Obama. I think he had I had an experience working with him as he was becoming president that to me speaks to this very much. And we were in the transition, December of 2008, and we were discussing, his advisors were discussing education policy for both the stimulus package and the agenda, and we were having different discussions and debates. And the president-elect at that point interrupted the conversation. And he said, let me ask, everything we're doing should be guided by the following three principles. Number one, let's focus on what are the policies that are going to actually benefit and improve outcomes for kids the most. Let's make this about kids and outcomes for kids. And he said, I'm hearing a little bit too much about the politics of this or that. Let's focus on what's good for kids. Number two, then let's figure out what's the political strategy to actually help achieve those policies. We have to be smart about the politics to achieve policies that are good for kids. And three, he said, let's not poke any fingers in anybody's eye along the way. Let's not attack individuals, attack institutions. Let's call for the right policies. Then if people disagree with that, they can critique the policy and we can have a debate about that. But let's not critique one another. And I think those three principles that then President-elect Obama articulated and then kind of framed what happened in his entire first term, to me really capture the way we ought to be approaching this work in education. We need to get back to the first in the world in education in terms of excellence and equity. We need to come together to do that. We need to have our policies and our practices being focused on what's going to be good for kids. We do need to be savvy politically about how political interests can support kids' interests, as opposed to how kids' interests can support political interests. And along the way, we ought not be poking people in the eye and name-calling and criticizing and finger-pointing. There's too much of that on all sides. Instead, we ought to say, how do we work together, and how do we have debates about, rigorous as appropriate for an American democracy, debates, an evidence-based debate about what's good for kids, but then find ways to come to common ground and work together. And I think those three principles, to me, are a good framework for how we approach the next phase of improving our schools. So thanks for the good question. Thanks to all of you, and I guess I'm going to turn it back to Dean McCartney.
Well,